She stopped me by the elevator. Not at night. Not in a whisper at the door. But in broad daylight, between floors, where the only sound is the low hum of the cabin and the soft click of the numbers above the doors. I was already late for work. I remember tightening my grip on my handbag, thinking only about traffic and coffee and how my feet ached in those shoes. Then my neighbor looked at me. Not casually. Not kindly. She looked at me the way you look at someone who's about to find out the truth too late. And she asked very quietly, "Do you even know who comes to your apartment when you're not home?" I laughed. I actually laughed. Because what kind of question is that? Who asks something like that in an elevator, with strangers breathing behind you and the doors about to open? But she didn't smile. She didn't laugh with me. She didn't soften it or apologize. She only added, almost as an afterthought, "It happens regularly. Always on the same day." The elevator doors closed. The numbers climbed. And suddenly the space felt too small. I wanted to ask her what she meant. I wanted to tell her she must be mistaken. But the doors opened, and she stepped out without another word. I rode the rest of the way down alone. And as I stood there, watching the numbers change, one thought would not leave my head. If I don't know who's entering my home, what else don't I know about my life? My name is Claire. I'm 58 now, though I still catch myself saying almost 60, as if the numbers might change if I say them softly. I was raised to be the steady one. The one who remembers birthdays, who keeps spare buttons in a tin, who knows where the light bulbs are stored and which drawer holds the batteries. I was a mother before I understood what rest really meant. 2 children close in age, always hungry for something. Food, attention, clean socks, reassurance. I learned to read a room the way some people read the weather. A slammed cupboard meant a bad day. A long silence at the dinner table meant someone needed a gentle question, not a lecture. I married Michael when we were both young enough to believe love could solve logistics. He had an easy charm, the kind that made other people feel included. My friends said I was lucky. My mother said, "Hold on to a man who brings people together." For years I did. I kept our home running like a quiet machine. Bills paid on time. Pantry stocked. Fresh towels folded and stacked, edges aligned. I worked too, not glamorous work but dependable work. And I never called it sacrifice because I didn't want my children to feel like they were a burden. I told myself that this was what stability looked like. And because I was the one holding everything, I trusted that the people around me would hold me in return. That's the part one didn't question. When we moved into this apartment, it felt like a new chapter, not a compromise. A bright kitchen window. A little balcony where I kept a pot of lavender because the scent made the evenings feel calmer. I placed a framed photo of the children on the shelf by the hallway mirror, the one you see as you put your keys down. Keys. I never thought twice about them. Michael was the sort of man who believed doors should be open, figuratively and literally. "We're not strangers," he'd say when his sister dropped by unannounced. "Family doesn't need appointments." He liked being the generous one. He liked saying yes. And I liked peace. So I became the woman who didn't mind. I didn't mind the extra place set at the table. I didn't mind the quick visits that turned into hours. I didn't mind the small inconveniences because they came wrapped in the language of togetherness. "Your place is so welcoming," people told me. I smiled because I thought that was a compliment. In my mind, a home was something you shared. A home was proof that you weren't alone. My children were grown by then, building lives of their own. And I told myself that an open door meant laughter would always find its way back to me. I never asked who had a spare key. I never asked who came in when I wasn't there. Because I truly believed that family meant safety. And if you're listening and wondering how a woman can be so certain, I understand the question. I understand it because I ask it of my past self now. But certainty is often just a habit you've practiced for a long time. I was used to being needed. Used to being the one who made things easy. Used to smoothing edges before anyone else noticed they were sharp. So when someone reached for more than they should have, I called it closeness. When someone crossed a line, I called it love. And that's why, until that moment in the elevator, I never once stood in my own hallway and thought, who comes into my apartment when I'm not home? Tuesdays were my longest day at the office. I left early, before the sun had properly warmed the street, and I came home with my shoulders tight from sitting too still. Michael worked from home some weeks and disappeared into meetings on others. Our schedules overlapped just enough to feel like a partnership, even when we were only passing each other like commuters. On those mornings I moved through the apartment by muscle memory. Kettle on, my pale blue mug with the chipped rim, toast in the pan because it smelled more like breakfast. I checked the calendar on the fridge, ran my finger down the week, and told myself that if the lists were handled, life was handled. If his sister needed something, she called him, not me. If a cousin was in town, Michael would say, they might pop by. The way you say it might rain. I would nod and adjust because adjusting was what I did. I didn't want to become suspicious. I didn't want to be the kind of woman who kept score. I'd watched bitterness take root in other marriages, and I confused boundaries with coldness. So I stayed soft. I stayed reasonable. That's why my neighbor's question didn't feel like gossip. It felt like a draft under a door I hadn't realized was cracked. Because if the place was always open, the way Michael liked to boast, then maybe it hadn't been mine to close. And that thought, once it appeared, didn't go away. I tried to shake it off, but even at my desk I kept seeing the hallway mirror, the key bowl, the lavender pot, and wondering what I hadn't seen before. After that day, the question didn't argue with me. Settled in. It moved through my thoughts the way dust moves through a room you think is clean. Quietly. Patiently. At first, I only noticed it when the light hit at a certain angle. I didn't become suspicious overnight. I didn't start searching drawers or counting footsteps. I still woke up the same way, made the same breakfast, followed the same routine that had carried me for decades. But something had shifted. A thin awareness had opened, and it refused to close again. I began to pause in the middle of ordinary things. Standing at the sink, hands in warm water, I would stop scrubbing a plate because the silence felt different. Not louder. Not emptier. Just altered. As if the apartment had learned a second rhythm that wasn't mine. The first thing I truly noticed was the smell. Lavender had always been my choice. I liked it because it was gentle, because it didn't demand attention. Laundry soap, hand lotion, the small sachets I kept folded into drawers. It was the scent of order, of evenings that ended calmly. It was familiar enough that I usually didn't notice it at all. But one Tuesday evening, I opened the door and smelled something else beneath it. Something sweeter. Heavier. Sharper at the edges. It wasn't unpleasant. That was the strange part. It was deliberate. Chosen. I stood there longer than necessary, coat still on, keys still in my hand, breathing it in and telling myself it was nothing. That smells drift. That elevators carry perfume. That memory is unreliable when you're tired. Still, I opened the windows. Then there was the furniture. Not rearranged. Not moved enough to accuse. Just adjusted. The dining chair nearest the balcony door was pulled back slightly. Its legs angled differently than I left them. Anyone else might have missed it. But I had pushed those chairs in thousands of times. I knew the sound they made against the floor. I knew the way they lined up when the room was right. I slid it back into place and felt embarrassed by the care I took. As if I were correcting a mistake that didn't exist. The mug came later. My pale blue mug with the chipped rim, the one I'd kept long after the set was broken, was sitting on the drying rack instead of in the cupboard. Clean. Still faintly warm. A tea bag string curled beside it. I told myself Michael must have used it. But Michael didn't like that mug. He liked things without history. Tall glasses. Smooth edges. Objects that didn't ask to be remembered. That night I mentioned it lightly, the way you mention weather. I didn't look at him. I kept my voice even. Did anyone stop by today? I asked. He glanced up. Why? I thought I smelled perfume. He smiled quickly, dismissively. You've been working too much. You start imagining things when you're tired. And that was it. No explanation. No curiosity. No follow-up. The conversation closed like a door I hadn't realized I was standing behind. Later, in bed, I lay awake listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing, and an old sentence floated back to me. Something he had said months earlier, laughing as he unlocked the door with grocery bags cutting into his hands. Our place is always open. Anyone can come in. At the time it had sounded warm. Generous. Now it sounded like a rule I had never agreed to. After that, I noticed patterns. Tuesdays were different. Tuesdays were my longest days. I left early, before the building fully woke up, and came home after dusk with my shoulders tight and my thoughts thin. On Tuesdays, the apartment felt touched by someone else's timing. Not messy. Not invaded. Used. A coaster left where I wouldn't leave it. The bathroom mirror wiped clean, but not in my careful vertical strokes. The refrigerator humming louder, as if opened and closed more often than necessary. I began checking the calendar without meaning to. Tuesday. Again. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask my neighbor more questions. I didn't accuse Michael or invent stories to scare myself. What I felt wasn't rage or jealousy. It was displacement. The quiet realization that I might not be the only woman moving through my own home. That the space I had kept running so carefully had developed a life that didn't include me. I kept doing what I'd always done. I folded laundry. I watered the lavender. I kissed my husband goodbye. But part of me no longer rested inside those routines. It watched. It listened. Because once a question like that enters your life, silence doesn't return. It waits. And it prepares you for what you're about to see. After the elevator, I stopped trusting my own ease. I didn't tell anyone. Not my children, not my friends. I didn't even tell Michael that his casual words had begun to sound like a lock turning the wrong way. I simply started moving through my days with a thin, careful attention. The way you walk when you suspect a step might creak. On Wednesday, I checked the key bowl by the hallway mirror and told myself I was only straightening it. The brass key ring sat on top, heavy and ordinary. I lifted it, felt the familiar weight in my palm, and set it down again as if that proved something. Then I caught my reflection, lips pressed tight, shoulders slightly raised, and I let my face soften, practicing the look of a woman with nothing to worry about. Thursday, I came home to the balcony door unlocked. Not open. Just unlocked. A small thing. A sensible mistake, Michael might say. But I stood with my hand on the latch, staring at the thin line of daylight where the frame met the glass, and I felt my stomach dip as if the floor had shifted. I locked it, then checked it twice, the metal clicking into place louder than it ever had before. By Friday, the question wasn't, is someone coming in? It was, who feels entitled to? Michael started to feel elsewhere. Not physically. He was still in the living room with his laptop, still asking if I wanted dinner, still kissing my cheek as he passed. But his attention slid off me. When I spoke, he answered too quickly, as if he'd already decided what I meant. When I asked about his week, he gave me tidy summaries instead of stories. Busy, he said. Same old, he said. And he smiled in a way that didn't invite more. His sister, Diane, called on Sunday and asked a question that startled me with its certainty. Are you going to be out Tuesday? I held the phone tighter. Why? Oh, no reason. Just wondering. Her voice stayed light, but there was a pause that felt rehearsed. Michael mentioned you've been working long days. He hadn't mentioned my days in years, not with that kind of detail. When we hung up, I stood in the kitchen listening to the refrigerator hum. The lavender on the counter looked pale in the winter light, and I found myself staring at it like it was a witness that couldn't speak. In the following days, relatives spoke around things. Sentences ended early. Jokes died halfway through. When I entered a room at a family dinner, conversation shifted like someone had nudged a steering wheel. I began to feel small in a way I hadn't felt since childhood. Not powerless, just edited. Like my presence changed what people were willing to say, as if I was a complication they'd rather avoid. On Monday night, I laid out my clothes for the next day with unusual care. Blouse ironed. Shoes by the door. Purse hung on the chair. I even washed my blue mug and placed it upside down in the cupboard, as if that could reset the day to come. Before bed, Michael said, "Big day tomorrow?" "Just Tuesday," I answered. He nodded too fast. "Right. Tuesday." He turned off the light, and in the dark I listened to his breathing and thought of my neighbor's face. Pitying, firm, almost protective. Between floors. Between answers. I realized something then with a cold, clean clarity. If my home was being entered, it wasn't happening by accident. And if it was happening regularly, someone had made a schedule. At work, I caught myself glancing at the time every Tuesday as if my watch could warn me. At 10:12 my phone buzzed with a, "Where are you?" From Michael, an odd message because he knew exactly where I was. I stared at the screen until it went dark, then replied, "At the office." He answered with a single thumbs up. No apology. No explanation. That afternoon I opened my banking app to feel grounded. Numbers were steady. Bills were paid. Still, I took screenshots of the last few transactions and emailed them to myself, then felt ridiculous and relieved. When I came home, the doormat was turned slightly, as if it had been nudged from the inside. The hallway smelled of citrus cleaner the building staff used, and my mind tried to cooperate with the simplest story. Someone had mopped. But I knew the building schedule. Cleaning was Fridays. I began to realize the deepest humiliation wasn't the possibility of a visitor. It was the possibility that everyone expected me to accept it. That I had been cast as the convenient one, the woman who wouldn't make a scene, who wouldn't ask for details, who would smooth everything over with a smile. I had built a life around being easy to live with. And now that same skill was being used as a doorway. By the time the next Tuesday arrived, my unease had hardened into intention. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't even angry yet. I was simply alert, the way you become alert when you finally admit you've been walking past a loose step for too long. I left the apartment as usual, but I didn't leave it the way I used to. I didn't change my route or slam the door behind me. I walked out on that Tuesday the way I always did. Chin up, keys in my fist, polite nod to the lobby camera as if I had nothing to hide. But I wasn't going to the office. At the corner cafe I bought a small coffee I barely tasted and sat by the window until my hands stopped trembling. Then I crossed the street to the little hardware shop and bought a plain, cheap door wedge, the kind you use when you're moving boxes. The clerk asked if I wanted a receipt. I said yes and folded it into my wallet like proof that this was real. By 9 o'clock I was back in the building, taking the stairs so I wouldn't have to face anyone in the elevator. I climbed slowly, listening for footsteps, counting each landing like a prayer. On the 4th floor I slipped into the stairwell alcove by the fire door, where the light was dim and the air smelled faintly of dust and old paint. I waited. The building had its usual sounds. A distant vacuum, a baby crying somewhere, the soft rattle of mail slots. I could hear my own heartbeat louder than I liked. I told myself I was being foolish. I told myself I would go upstairs, unlock my door, and find nothing at all. I even rehearsed the sentence I would say to myself afterward. Claire, you're tired. Go to work. Then at 10:06 I heard the elevator stop. The doors opened with their familiar sigh, and footsteps stepped out. Confident, unhurried. Not the cautious steps of a stranger. Not the hesitant steps of someone lost. Keys jingled. A brief pause. My door being handled. I pressed my palm to the cool metal of the stairwell railing so I wouldn't move. Through the narrow gap between the stairwell door and its frame, I saw a shoulder, then a handbag strap, then the unmistakable sweep of Diane's blonde hair. My sister-in-law. She didn't knock. She didn't call my name. She simply unlocked my door and walked in as if she lived there. For a moment my mind tried to rearrange the scene into something harmless. Maybe Michael asked her to pick something up. Maybe she was dropping off a casserole. Maybe. But she was alone. And she carried an empty tote bag. I waited another minute, then another, breathing through my nose like I'd learned in childbirth classes decades ago. The minutes felt thick. I imagined her in my kitchen opening cupboards, taking stock. I imagined her in my bedroom, opening drawers that held nothing scandalous, just my life. At 10:18 the door opened again. Diane stepped out with the tote bag now rounded and heavy. She adjusted it on her shoulder, checked her phone, and locked my door behind her with the ease of practice. That was the part that hurt most. Not the theft, though I didn't yet know what she'd taken. The ease. The normalcy. She turned toward the elevator, and as she waited, she glanced down the hallway and smiled at someone I couldn't see. A quiet, private smile, as if she belonged to a plan. The elevator arrived. Before the doors closed, another figure slipped in beside her. Michael's cousin Lena, the one who always hugged me too hard at family dinners. They rode down together. I stayed where I was until the elevator's hum faded. When I finally moved, my legs felt hollow, as if they weren't quite mine. I unlocked my door and stepped into my own apartment like a stranger entering a room after a party. The air smelled of that sweet perfume again. The kitchen drawers weren't open, but one utensil lay crooked, just slightly out of line. My blue mug was on the counter, damp at the rim. I walked to the bedroom, opened the closet, and saw a gap where my winter scarf had been. A soft gray wool one my daughter had given me 2 Christmases ago. The jewelry box on my dresser was closed, but the latch sat wrong, not fully aligned. I didn't sit. I didn't cry. I stood very still, and something inside me went silent. This had been happening for a long time. And it hadn't been done in secret. It had been done with permission. I went to the hallway mirror first. The little ceramic dish where I dropped my keys was turned slightly, as if someone's elbow had brushed it. The framed photo of my children sat a fraction off-center. Tiny changes, the kind you dismiss until you're forced to admit they form a language. In the kitchen, I opened the cupboard under the sink. The spare trash bags were missing from the roll. My good olive oil had been moved forward. In the refrigerator, the butter dish was on a different shelf. I ran a finger along the glass, absurdly hoping for a print. Then my phone chimed. A message from Michael. "How's your morning?" I typed, "Fine. Busy," and felt my own lie land heavy. I stood there, listening to the fridge hum, and understood with bitter clarity. They weren't sneaking. They were using. At the table, I searched my email and found Diane's old note. I kept a copy for emergencies. I'd answered with a smiley face. My throat tightened. Emergency meant their will. Everything fell into place the way loose coins finally settle at the bottom of a purse. I started with what I could prove, not what I could feel. Feelings can be dismissed. Receipts can't. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and my blue mug beside it, untouched. The apartment was quiet again, but it didn't feel calm. It felt staged, like a room that has been reset after someone walked through it. First, I searched my email for Diane's name. I found little things I'd forgotten. "Can you buzz me in? Left something for Michael. I'll swing by Tuesday, okay?" And every time my answers were polite and automatic. "Sure. No problem. Of course." Then I searched for the word key. There it was. A message from 2 years ago, the week Michael and I went away for our anniversary. Diane had written, "I kept a copy for emergencies, just in case." I had replied with a smiley face and, "Thank you." Emergency. That word had sounded responsible then. Now it sounded like ownership. I opened the building's resident portal and checked the maintenance log. The staff always recorded when they entered for inspections. Nothing for Tuesdays. Nothing at all. So it wasn't the building. Next, I opened my banking app again, the way someone presses a bruise to see if it still hurts. The main account looked steady. But when I pulled up linked payments, I noticed something I'd never bothered to study. A small monthly transfer from our joint account into an account labeled household support. Michael had set it up. The amount was €450, sent every Tuesday morning. Every Tuesday. I clicked into the details and saw the recipient name. Diane. My throat went dry, not from surprise, but from the way the numbers confirmed the pattern my body had already learned. It wasn't a favor. It was a system. I checked the last 6 months. Same day. Same amount. Like rent. Then I opened our shared calendar. There were appointments I hadn't added. Drop-off. Pickup. Storage. They were all marked private. Michael had never used the calendar for anything but doctor visits and birthdays. Yet here it was. An entire Tuesday routine living beside my life. I walked to the linen closet and pulled out the box where I kept old paperwork. Warranties, insurance letters, the boring things that keep a household afloat. Underneath, folded neatly, was a set of spare keys I didn't recognize, newer, shiny with a yellow tag. I stared at them until my eyes watered, because I understood exactly what they were without needing to ask. Copies. More than one. In the bedroom, I opened my jewelry box again, slower this time. The items were there, mostly, but a small velvet pouch was gone. The one that held my mother's ring. Not expensive, just meaningful. I hadn't worn it in years. That was why it was safe. Or so I thought. I went back to the kitchen and scrolled through Tuesday photos on my phone. In one taken last spring, you could see the key bowl in the background. 2 key rings instead of one. I hadn't noticed at the time. In another photo, the balcony chair was shifted, the exact angle I'd corrected. Evidence hiding in plain sight. By late afternoon, the truth wasn't a single shocking discovery. It was a stack of small, undeniable facts. They had keys. They had a schedule. They had money. They had each other. And I, who had paid, cooked, hosted, listened, had been reduced to the quiet woman who wouldn't check. I didn't need to imagine what they did inside my home. The confidence told me enough. You don't tiptoe in a place you fear. You don't unlock a door you don't believe belongs to you. That evening Michael came home and kissed my cheek, smelling faintly of cologne, as if nothing had shifted in the world. "How was your day?" he asked. I looked at him and realized he wasn't asking because he wanted to know. He was asking to make sure I was still asleep. I answered, "Fine," and felt the words sit between us like a stone. In the quiet afterward, I opened a fresh document on my laptop and began listing what I knew line by line, with dates and amounts. Not because I planned a fight, because for the first time in my life I was choosing clarity over comfort. I checked the Wi-Fi app next. Michael had insisted on managing it, so you don't have to deal with settings. Our browser still remembered the login. A list of devices appeared: phones, tablets, something labeled an iPad. Under it, last connected Tuesdays 10:09 to 10:42. Week after week. In the hallway cabinet above the fuse box behind spare bulbs, a thin folder was tucked away. It was a storage contract across town, paid quarterly from our joint card. The renter name wasn't mine. It was Michael's. The access code was written in Diane's handwriting. That was when I understood the tote bag. It wasn't help. It was inventory. My home had become a supply room for other people's plans. I sat there listening to the fridge and the clock and felt, simply counted today. I sat there longer than I expected to. The document on my laptop was still open, the cursor blinking patiently at the end of a sentence I hadn't finished. Outside the window a car passed, tires hissing softly on damp pavement. Somewhere above me someone closed a drawer. Ordinary sounds. A perfectly normal evening. And yet something fundamental had shifted. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like sediment in clear water, until the shape of it became impossible to ignore. I hadn't been betrayed because I was careless. I had been betrayed because I was kind. Because kindness assumes good faith. Because it leaves room for people to be decent without needing to prove it first. I had built my life around that belief. I had believed that if I showed up fully, if I held things together, if I made space, then the people closest to me would protect that space with me. Instead, they had learned it. They had learned my routines. They had learned which days I was gone. They had learned that I didn't check, didn't question, didn't count. And once they learned, they used it. Looking back, the signs rearranged themselves with painful clarity. The jokes about how easygoing I was. The way decisions were announced instead of discussed. How often I was thanked after something was already done, instead of asked before it happened. None of it had felt cruel at the time. That was the trick. It had felt practical, efficient, like everyone was simply helping themselves to what was available. And I had made myself endlessly available. That understanding didn't ignite rage the way movies promise it will. Cooled me. It steadied me. It was like stepping out of a loud room into clean air. I wasn't foolish. I wasn't weak. I wasn't blind. I had been generous in a world that mistakes generosity for permission. I closed the laptop and rested my hands flat on the table. They didn't shake. That surprised me. I waited for the wave of grief, the collapse, the need to confront someone immediately just to hear my own voice rise. None of that came. What came instead was resolve. Quiet. Almost courteous in its certainty. I didn't need explanations. Explanations were just another way to be pulled back into their story. I didn't need apologies spoken with urgency and tears. Apologies would have asked me to soften again. I stood up and walked to the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me hadn't changed. Same fine lines. Same tired eyes. Same familiar face. But there was something different behind it now. She wasn't waiting. She was deciding. I thought of my neighbor by the elevator. The careful way she had spoken. No drama. No urgency. Just truth offered plainly, as if she trusted me to know what to do with it. That too had been a kindness. I moved through the apartment slowly, not to search for more proof, but to reclaim it in my mind. The chair by the window where I read in the evenings. The kitchen counter where I lined up cups in the morning. The lavender plant, pale and steady, still doing its quiet work. This space had been mine long before anyone decided it was useful. And it would be mine again. I didn't rehearse confrontations. I didn't imagine raised voices or dramatic exits. That would have kept me anchored to their expectations. Instead, my thoughts went somewhere else entirely. Locks. Accounts. Permissions. Simple things. Practical things. Things that didn't require an audience. Kindness had shaped my past, but clarity would shape what came next. I reached for my coat, feeling the weight of it settle on my shoulders, and for the first time since that question by the elevator, my breath came easily. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I was. I didn't announce what I was about to do. There was no dramatic moment where I sat Michael down and demanded answers. No raised voice. No trembling hands clutching evidence. I understood something very clearly by then. Explanations were just another form of negotiation, and I was done negotiating my right to my own life. The next morning I followed my routine exactly. Same coat. Same shoes. Same careful check of my reflection before I left the apartment. I even paused by the hallway mirror, the one where I had set my keys down for years, and allowed myself a moment to feel the weight of them in my hand. Then I locked the door behind me and stepped into the elevator, standing in the same corner where my neighbor had once changed everything with a single sentence. The cabin hummed. The numbers slid downward. Nothing looked different. That was the strange part. From the outside, my life still appeared perfectly intact. But I wasn't going to work. I walked past my usual bus stop and kept going, feeling the cold air steady me. 2 streets over was the locksmith, the small shop with the faded blue sign and the bell that rang too loudly when you opened the door. I chose him because he looked like a man who respected privacy, a man who understood that sometimes people don't want conversation, they want resolution. I laid my keys on the counter one by one. I need everything changed, I said. Today. He didn't ask why. He didn't smile. He simply nodded and began writing. By noon my door answered only to me. I tested the new locks myself, turning the key slowly, feeling the clean resistance, the quiet certainty of metal meeting intention. Old keys would no longer work. Old permissions had nowhere to land. From there I went to the bank. I sat across from a young woman with tired eyes and careful manners and asked her to separate the accounts. I didn't tell a story. I didn't explain history or hurt or betrayal. I pointed. I stated dates. I said, this account requires 2 signatures now. This transfer stops today. This access ends. She hesitated once. Are you sure? Yes, I said. And I meant far more than money. I cancelled the Tuesday transfer, €450 every week without discussion. I changed passwords, recovery emails, phone numbers. Each click felt strangely mundane, like closing windows before a storm you already knew was coming. In the afternoon I bought a small safe. Nothing dramatic. Something that fit quietly in the back of my closet. That evening I placed my documents inside, passport, birth certificate, insurance papers, and locked it. The sound was soft, but it landed deep inside me. Back home, I opened the hallway cabinet above the fuse box and removed every spare key. All of them. I lined them up on the table and looked at them for a long moment. They were ordinary things, harmless looking, and yet they had carried so much assumption. I placed them into an envelope and wrote a single word on the front. Returned. No note. No explanation. That night I sat at the kitchen table with my blue mug, the chipped rim warm against my palms, when I heard the key turn in the door. Pause. Another attempt. A sharper twist. The sound of confusion. Claire. Michael called through the door. I stood slowly. I didn't rush. I didn't brace myself. I walked to the hallway and answered evenly. I'm here. There's something wrong with the lock. No, I said. There was something wrong with the access. There was silence on the other side. Then a laugh, light, uncertain, reaching for familiarity. What is this? He asked. Are you upset about something? I opened the door, but I didn't step aside. I handed him the envelope. You can call first, I said. Like everyone else. He stared at the keys as if they had betrayed him. I'm not angry, I added. I'm finished explaining. Then I closed the door. I rested my forehead against the wood for a moment, not in weakness but in relief. My heart was steady. My hands were calm. For the first time in a very long while, my home was quiet, not because I had made myself small, but because I had finally chosen myself. The consequences didn't explode. They unfolded. They arrived in fragments carried by missed plans, uncomfortable silences, and questions that were never meant to be asked out loud. No one showed up at my door demanding explanations. No one shouted. No one accused me directly. They didn't need to. The first real sign came when Tuesday passed without anyone admitting it mattered. Diane didn't call again that week. Instead, I heard from Michael's cousin Lena, who texted late in the evening with a tone that tried very hard to sound neutral. "Hey, quick question. Did you change something with the apartment?" I read the message twice, then set the phone down. I didn't answer. I had spent years answering questions that weren't really questions at all, just openings for negotiation. This one didn't deserve a response either. The following weekend, Michael came home quiet, carrying the weight of other people's irritation like it was his own. He didn't sit down right away. He hovered, pretending to check his phone, pretending to be casual. "They're having trouble with things," he said eventually. "What things?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Storage. Scheduling. Just things." I nodded and returned to folding laundry. The rhythm of it steadied me. Shirt sleeve edge. Shirt sleeve edge. "They were counting on access," he added carefully. "I was counting on respect," I said. My voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. That was when I noticed how often the word counting came up. Counting on me. Counting on the apartment. Counting on Tuesdays. Counting on money that moved quietly, reliably, without questions. Once the counting stopped, confusion set in. Family dinners became tentative. Invitations arrived late, then earlier than usual, then not at all. When I did attend, conversations felt staged. People watched their words. Laughed a second too late. Changed subjects when I entered the room. I had become unpredictable. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just unavailable. Someone mentioned casually that it was harder now to coordinate things. Someone else joked that rules had suddenly appeared. I smiled politely and continued eating, aware that the rules they meant were simply the presence of consent. Apologies came next. Not the kind that admit harm. The kind that admit inconvenience. "I didn't realize you felt that way. We never meant to upset you. You know how family is." Each message carried the same quiet request. "Please go back to being easy." What none of them said was, "We should have asked." What none of them acknowledged was that my home had been used as infrastructure, a place to store, to pass through, to borrow from, without my participation. Michael struggled with it longer than the others. He wasn't angry at first. He was confused, then defensive, then tired. "I just didn't think it mattered," he said one night, sitting at the edge of the bed. "That's the problem," I replied. "It mattered because it was mine." After that, he stopped defending them so openly. Not because he suddenly understood everything, but because the evidence of their entitlement became harder to ignore. They complained more about access than they asked about me. They wanted solutions, not reconciliation. Weeks passed. Tuesdays became quiet again. Predictably quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't hide anything. No footsteps. No phone calls checking where I was. No sense of being timed. What struck me most wasn't their resentment. It was how quickly they reorganized once they had to. They found other places to store things. Other people to rely on. Other systems that didn't depend on my silence. The need had never been me. It had been convenience. And once convenience was gone, so was the closeness. Standing in my kitchen one Tuesday afternoon, light falling across the counter, I understood something that felt both sad and liberating. I hadn't broken the family. I had simply removed myself from a role I was never asked to agree to. Boundaries hadn't caused the distance. They had exposed how conditional the closeness had always been. And in that space, that honest, unoccupied space, I finally felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not triumph. Peace. The quiet that followed surprised me. Not because it was loud before, but because of how much effort I had once put into managing it. For years, silence in my home had meant anticipation. Waiting for someone to arrive. Waiting for a message. Waiting to be needed. Now, silence simply meant that nothing was happening, and nothing was expected of me. The first Tuesday after everything settled, I came home at my usual time and stopped just inside the door. The apartment smelled like lavender again. Only lavender. No second layer. No faint sweetness underneath. The air felt untouched, the way it does when a room has belonged to itself all day. I placed my keys in the bowl by the mirror and noticed, with a small sense of wonder, that there was only one set. Mine. I made tea and sat at the table without opening my phone. No checking messages. No scanning for tension. The blue mug warmed my hands, the chipped rim familiar against my lip. Outside, the building hummed with ordinary life, doors opening, footsteps passing, but none of it was aimed at me. I hadn't realized how long I'd been living as a shared space. Now my home was singular again. Over the following weeks, I began to change small things. Not out of anger. Out of intention. I moved the chair by the window closer to the light. I cleared a shelf and placed only what I loved there. I donated the extra sets of dishes I'd kept just in case. There was no case anymore. I started leaving work earlier on Tuesdays. Not because I had to, but because I could. I walked instead of taking the bus, letting the rhythm of my steps settle me. Sometimes I bought flowers. Sometimes I didn't. Both choices felt equally valid. Michael adjusted slowly. He learned to call. To ask. To accept that access was no longer assumed. We spoke less but more honestly. When something was said, it meant something. When silence appeared, it wasn't punishment, it was rest. My children noticed the change before I named it. "You sound lighter," my daughter said over the phone one evening. "I am," I answered. And for once I didn't feel the need to explain why. I invited people over when I wanted to. One friend at a time. Planned. Present. When the evening ended, they left. And I closed the door with a sense of completion, not loss. The lavender thrived. I repotted it, gave it a larger container, placed it where the sun lingered longest. Watching it grow felt symbolic without being sentimental. Some things need room to breathe. On Tuesdays, I cooked simpler meals. I read. I sat on the balcony wrapped in a light scarf, listening to the city soften as evening arrived. No wondering who might walk in. No checking the clock. Because no one did. I hadn't rebuilt my life. I had reclaimed it. And in doing so, I learned something I wish I had understood sooner. Peace doesn't come from being indispensable. Comes from being sovereign. My home was quiet now. Not because I was alone, but because I was finally free. I still think about that moment in the elevator sometimes. Not with fear anymore. With gratitude. One quiet question, asked without drama, without accusation, shifted the course of my life. It didn't destroy anything that was truly mine. It only revealed what had been slowly costing me myself. For a long time I believed strength meant endurance. Staying. Absorbing. Making things work no matter how uneven they became. I thought dignity lived in patience, in silence, in being the last one to complain. I know better now. Dignity lives in clarity. It lives in knowing where you end and where others begin. In understanding that love without respect is not generosity, it is erosion. And erosion happens so slowly that you don't notice the ground disappearing until you're standing on air. I didn't lose my family. I lost an illusion about my role in it. And in that loss, I gained something steadier than approval. I gained ownership of my days, of my space, of my voice. I gained the ability to lock a door without guilt and open it only when I choose. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is stop explaining herself. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've ever laughed off a question that unsettled you, or dismissed a discomfort because it seemed easier than facing it, I want you to know this. Pay attention to the quiet moments, to the small questions that linger. They are not there to scare you. They are there to save you. If this story touched a nerve, you belong here. Subscribe to hear truths where silence becomes strength. And remember, choosing yourself is not an ending. It is the most honest beginning you will ever have.